Your sexual fantasies are not fantasies. They're a disorder, and they're controlling you right now. If the same images invade your mind every day, if they interrupt your work, your relationships, your sleep, if you can't stop them no matter how hard you try, you don't have a dirty mind. You have sexual fantasy disorder. And it's not about sex, it's about something much darker. Here's what psychologists know. Sexual fantasy disorder happens when your brain loops the same scenarios over and over until you can't focus on anything else. You're in a meeting and it hits. You're with your partner and it hits. You're trying to sleep and it hits. A fantasy so shocking, so intense that you freeze and think, what is wrong with me? Comment the word aware if this is you. Say it publicly. Admit that your mind goes places you never asked it to go. Because the first step to freedom is acknowledging the cage. Nothing is wrong with you, but something is screaming inside you, and you're not listening. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the part of yourself that society taught you to bury, the sexual thoughts, the forbidden desires, the images you were told make you disgusting. But the shadow doesn't disappear when you hide it. It grows, it mutates, and then it explodes through intrusive fantasies so disturbing you can't believe they came from your own mind. This is why the most moral people often have the darkest inner worlds. The stricter the rules, the more violent the rebellion. A priest consumed by thoughts of sin, a devoted partner haunted by images of betrayal, a gentle person fantasizing about violence. That's not hypocrisy. That's the rebound effect of repression. Psychologists have studied this for decades. The more you try not to think about something, the more it dominates your mind. In the famous white bear experiment, participants were told not to think about a white bear. The result? They couldn't stop thinking about it. Every attempt to suppress the thought made it stronger. Now imagine doing that with your sexuality for years. The result isn't purity. The result is obsession. The result is a mind that won't let you rest. A therapist once worked with a woman who couldn't stop fantasizing about violent sexual scenarios. She was terrified she was becoming dangerous. She avoided being alone with people. She questioned her own sanity. But after months of therapy, the truth emerged. She didn't crave violence. She craved control after years of feeling powerless in an abusive relationship. Her mind turned her need for safety into violent images because that was the only language her unconscious knew how to speak loud enough to be heard. Another case. A man consumed by fantasies of submission and humiliation. He felt disgusted with himself. He was a leader, a decision maker, someone people respected. How could he want to be degraded? But the therapist discovered something else. He had spent his entire life performing, being strong, being in control, never showing weakness. His fantasy wasn't about humiliation. It was about finally being allowed to let go, to stop performing, to be vulnerable without judgment. So, what is your fantasy disorder really about? Is it about the image itself? Or is it about the unmet need hiding behind the image? Because every fantasy is a code, and until you crack that code, you'll keep suffering. Domination fantasies often hide a history of feeling invisible. When you've spent years being ignored, dismissed, talked over, treated like you don't matter, your unconscious creates a fantasy where you finally have power, where people listen, where you matter. The fantasy of control isn't about cruelty, it's about dignity. It's about finally being seen after a lifetime of invisibility. Submission fantasies often hide exhaustion. When you've carried too much responsibility for too long, when every decision falls on you, when you can never rest, your unconscious creates a fantasy where someone else takes control, where you don't have to think, where you can finally surrender. The fantasy of submission isn't about weakness, it's about relief. It's about the desperate need to stop carrying the weight of the world. Even humiliation fantasies make sense when you decode them. If you grew up with shame, if you were humiliated as a child, if you learned that vulnerability equals pain, your mind does something strange. It turns the shame into something you control. You fantasize about humiliation not because you want it, but because choosing it gives you power over what once destroyed you. You rewrite the story by controlling the narrative. Your fantasy is not the message. Your fantasy is the mask. The real message lives underneath. The wound, the need, the part of you that's been screaming for years and finally found a way to force you to pay attention. And the more you ignore it, the louder it screams. The more disturbing the images become. The more obsessive the thoughts grow. Did you know that forbidden fantasies trigger the same dopamine spikes as addictive drugs? Your brain rewards shock because shock forces awareness. This is why the more taboo the thought, the stronger it sticks. Not because you want to act it out, but because your unconscious won't let you ignore what it's desperately trying to tell you. The brain doesn't care about your comfort. It cares about survival. And if you're ignoring a wound, it will use whatever weapon it has to make you look. Sexual fantasy disorder becomes a disorder when you mistake the symbol for the truth. When you think the fantasy defines who you are instead of revealing what you need. When you carry shame instead of curiosity. When you bury it deeper instead of asking what it means. When you let the images control you instead of decoding their message. So let me ask you directly. What are you really craving? Not in the fantasy itself. Underneath it, strip away the shocking images. Strip away the taboo scenarios. What's left? Respect? Safety? Freedom? Power? Love? Connection? Release? The fantasy is just the language your unconscious speaks. The need underneath is the truth you've been running from your entire life. And here's what makes it worse. The more you run, the stronger it gets. Ignoring your shadow doesn't erase it. It gives it total control. Every time you bury a thought, you feed it. Every time you shame yourself for having it, you make it more powerful. Every time you promise yourself you'll stop thinking about it, you guarantee it will come back stronger. But every time you face it, you take back your power. Every time you ask what it means instead of what's wrong with you, you break the cycle. Every time you treat the fantasy as a message instead of a sin, you move closer to freedom. Comment aware right now if you're ready to stop running. Say it publicly. Own it. Because the moment you stop hiding is the moment you start healing. This is not about acting out your fantasies. This is not about indulging every thought. This is about understanding that your mind is not your enemy. It's trying to help you. It's screaming at you in the only language it knows. And until you learn to listen, you'll stay trapped in the loop. The shame, the obsession, the endless cycle of thoughts you can't control. So here's your choice. Keep running from the fantasy and let it consume your life. Let it invade every quiet moment. Let it fill you with shame and fear and self-hatred. Or stop. Turn around. Face it. Ask what it's really trying to tell you. Decode the message. Heal the wound. And finally, be free. Subscribe to Psychology by Sergiu Popovici. We don't sugarcoat. We expose the raw truths others are too afraid to touch. This is where masks come off. This is where lies die. Comment aware if you're ready to face yourself. No filters, no excuses, just truth.